Next up, we've got Project Next, which is one of the sessions I've been looking forward to throughout the weekend. We've got 5 different game makers giving us peeks at games in progress. We got Jonathan Blow. We have the Bit Trip Runner Gauging Games folks here. We've got Ian Bogos, Paolo Petruccini, and Chris Hecker, all talking about new works in progress. A couple of the games you've probably already heard about. John's The Witness, Chris's Spy Party, but the other 3 are, as far as I know, not that talked about yet. So anyway, I'm going to turn things over to John and let him get started.
Hey, so yeah, I'm Jonathan Blow. My next game is called The Witness. It's an adventure game-ish thing, and what that means I'll kind of explain. It's not going to be done for at least a year. My last game is this game called Braid, and when I first started designing it, I imagined that I would be designing a bunch of intricate intellectual puzzles that over the course of the game the player learns about and solves ever more intricate things having to do with manipulating time. But as I went on through the design process, I found that the simpler that I made levels, right, the more minimalistic that I made them, then the better they felt in order to play, and the better they felt to solve, to come to a final discovery. Right here is one of the simplest levels in the game where there's a pit that's too deep for you to get out of, and often players will come to this pit and they'll know before they do anything that it's impossible, or it appears to be impossible to win this level. But then they have some idea and they try it and suddenly it works, and like magic happens. They have this aha moment. And there are many such aha moments in the game, and I came to really value those in the design process and try to build them out. So in the new game, I'm thinking of it not quite as aha, but now as epiphany, which is a little more of a formalized concept, or at least sounds better. You know, the idea behind epiphany is that you don't understand something, and then suddenly some rapid state change occurs in your mind, and you do understand something. And it's not necessarily logical. You know, I already know that it's possible to create small epiphanies like these ones that are in Braid, but we also know within the range of human experience that much more powerful epiphanies are also possible. You know, things where somebody comes to a realization and it changes their life forever. Aiming for something like this as a game designer in 2010 is maybe a little bit ambitious, but I think by working hard, maybe we can find somewhere a little bit higher in the middle ground. Now, because most of what we're steeped in as tradition, you know, as game designers, is puzzle games, and so I want to clarify that the epiphany I'm talking about is not like the feeling that you get when there's some complex puzzle with lots of moving parts and constraints, and like you have to visualize it all in your head at once, and then that lets you figure it out, and you come to a conclusion, and you solve the puzzle, and it feels good, and then you have this understanding in your head that you can carry to future puzzles. That's cool. It's a nice thing that games can do, but that's not what I'm talking about, right? The epiphany I'm talking about is something that was so simple that you didn't see it, right? You didn't understand it because it's so small and simple that it flew under the radar of all the assumptions that you have to make from day to day in order to function as a human being in the world, right? Something violates one of those assumptions or shows you one of those assumptions is false, and that's a powerful epiphany experience. So what does that mean? If I'm going to design a game around this idea of epiphany, what am I trying to do game mechanically? Well, it's pretty clear to me that epiphany requires a lot of space and freedom for the player. You know, you can't go up to somebody and say, hey you, right now I demand that you have a life-changing moment of clarity, right? That just doesn't result in anything useful. Wow, I'm totally blanking on what I was saying.
You're about to have an epiphany.
I am. I feel like okay, but there's also, you know, there are also best practices in game design that, you know, we've decided are best practices, but that, you know, often kill this idea of epiphany and other things. So one thing that we'll often do, if we're not trying to directly control the player, is we'll try to guide them too heavily, right? Because with epiphany, the best thing you can do, you know, is make space for it to happen and help people get there, but you can't help them too strongly, right? One thing we do very often is we over-tutorialize in games. There's this idea that, you know, when you bring a new idea into your gameplay, the player's not going to understand it. So you have to tutorialize it so much that there's no question that anybody would ever be confused. It's totally clear. And then as a game designer, you're allowed to use that in a puzzle for real, you know, by game designer rules. And the problem with that is it kills epiphany. It kills related things that are also valuable, like the joy of discovery, right? So I don't like that, and I'm trying not to do that. Another aspect of Epiphany is that in order to feel fair, and in order to have that kind of power to affect player, the clarity of the experience cannot be hidden, right? One way that you might imagine to put an Epiphany in a game is, it's in there, whatever you want the player to see is in there, and then you cover it up, you obscure it by all sorts of complicated things, right? And then the player goes and untangles all those complicated things, and then they see what you meant them to see, but that is not going to feel like an Epiphany, because you didn't, because the thing wasn't hidden by virtue of its supreme truth or anything like that. It was just hidden because you made a mess, and then you force the player to clean up a mess in order to see it. And this is actually what most of puzzle game design is like today, is making a big mess. And therefore, a lot of puzzle games aren't that fun. And now I'm going to segue into a genre rant about adventure games, which is what I'm trying to play in now with this new game. And that clarity is actually the thing that adventure games have always been worst at. This comic that I was showing prior to the talk is funny, but it's funny because it's true. The core gameplay of games like Myst is coming up to some levers and buttons or whatever and not really being sure what they do, and not really playing with them in a deep way for a while. You're just figuring out what the hell is going on, right? Puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. And I love adventure games. Adventure games basically got me into programming. But as a designer, looking back on decades of adventure games, I have to admit that the actual gameplay experience that's going on in a player's head when they play these games is really just a lot of fumbling and bumbling that's very, very distant from the peak experience that the designer intends the player to have, right? The actual gameplay of an adventure game is things like, if it's a text game, why doesn't the parser understand what I'm trying to do? That's like 80% of input in a text adventure, right? If it's a graphic adventure, am I trying to go through that door to get to the next area, or is it like background art and what I'm trying to do is somewhere else, right? Is this thing that I'm interacting with right now, is that a puzzle, or is it a mildly interactive decorative thing? And if it is a puzzle, do I even have what I need to solve it, or does it require some obscure object that I won't even have until later in the game, right? And then, I've been working with this puzzle for a long time, and I'm really frustrated, and I haven't solved it, but it's worse because it's so arbitrary and stupid. Like, I can't even respect this puzzle. I don't understand why the game designer wants me to put so much effort into such a stupid idea. The canonical example of which is the cat hair mustache from Gabriel Knight 4, which led Eric Volpov, Old Man Murray, to say, who killed adventure games? I think it should be pretty clear at this point that adventure games committed suicide. And that's a sentiment that I agree with wholeheartedly. I love adventure games, but it's very clear to me that adventure games are totally unplayable by modern standards, right? If you go back to the 80s and play a lot of the games we all love, like home games, they're mostly, or pretty much all, unplayable by modern standards, right? But what happened over the past few decades is a lot of those genres evolved. They became, more fruitful to play. They became more interesting, less needlessly punishing, right? But adventure games never quite figured out how to do that. Or, another way of viewing it is that positive aspects of adventure games got subsumed into other genres, but they never made it on their own. And that's why the audience of adventure games now is very small relative to the audience for other game types. So going into this game now, designing something new, I ask myself, if before, and try to design around them, those are problems of the genre, and I can't really solve them while staying in that genre. So my game is leaving that genre and becoming something else. And what is it going to become? And here's some sort of design ideas that I've arrived at and that characterize the play of my game. There's no inventory at all. You don't ever pick up an object, so there's no question about whether you have something to use or not. That's basically true. There's a small set of interactable things that are clearly depicted, right? So there's like a button, there's a lever, there's a switch. They always look the same everywhere, no matter what machine they're attached to, right? And they're always very clearly marked. This is very, very standard design practice in every genre of game design except for adventure games. When there's a puzzle in the game that you need to solve in order to win, it's very clearly marked. There's no question that it's a puzzle, and there's actually no question exactly what you need to do to solve the puzzle. The only question is exactly how you do it. And that removes a lot of that, piles of junk and unsureness that litter adventure games. And the last thing is it's constructed in a very nonlinear fashion. It's an open world adventure game. So if you're stuck in an area and you just can't figure it out, you can go and play the rest of the game before coming back to that puzzle, or maybe you don't even need to come back to it because you're able to win without solving that puzzle you were stuck on, because the game is treating you with a very loose hand. And the last idea I want to talk about is this one. I've heard this from a number of friends over the past year, including a friend here at the conference. He said, you know, it's so great when a game makes you feel smart. You know, that's wonderful, and that's what we ought to be trying to do as game designers. I think that's a terrible idea. Because when you play a game like a puzzle game or an epiphany game or whatever it is, right, the valuable thing, the most valuable thing isn't the feeling of being smart. It's that you actually are smart for a moment, right? It's that you actually did something and some new idea came into your head and you have some new understanding that you can take forward into the future in a much less transient way than this very temporary feeling, right? And if we go into this with our goal as game designers to create the feeling of being smart or the feeling of being cool or whatever, then we'll end up making relatively shallow things, right? We'll end up making things that don't actually have the intellectual depth that characterizes you know, deep experiences and profound experiences. We're instead kind of pandering, right? So I think this attitude is a disease, and I'm trying to stay away from it as far as possible. Thanks very much.